Welcome everyone. Welcome to the latest in this season's School of Management book series. My name's Steve Brammer. I'm Dean of the University of Bath School of Management, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you all here today, I hope, for a really wonderful event. Our book series, as many of you will know, is a series of events in which we celebrate and explore recent books written by members of the School of Management community. The events give us an opportunity to hear from leading experts about their books and provide our audiences with an opportunity to pose questions and engage directly with the book's authors. It's lovely to see colleagues here today, and also welcome to those of you who will watch this after the fact online. Today, I'm delighted to welcome a wonderful colleague, Professor Yasin Rofcanin, to talk about his book, Idiosyncratic Deals at Work, Exploring Individual, Organizational and Societal Perspectives, which I have here, which is wonderful, and I've had some fun reading as you will hear in the next little while. Let me first introduce today's author, Yasin Rofcanin. As well as being all-round fantastic guy and wonderful collaborator here in the School of Management at Bath, Yasin is a professor of organizational behavior and human resource management in our School of Management here at the university. He obtained his PhD in organizational behavior and HRM from Warwick Business School at the University of Warwick. And before that, he earned his BA in management from Istanbul at Boğaziçi University. Yasin's research focuses on flexible work practices, family supportive supervisor behaviors, HRM differentiation, idiosyncratic deals, we'll talk a bit about that today, job crafting and employee work engagement. His research has appeared in journals including Journal of Applied Psychology, Human Relations, Journal of Organizational Behavior, Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology, among others. He's worked closely with consultancy and practices around the world on a wide range of topics, including flexible work practices, HR redesign, and getting back to work post-COVID. I feel certain there'll be a COVID question coming to you a bit later, Yasin. Today, we talk about idiosyncratic deals at work, which has just hit the shelves of every good bookstore and digital provider globally. So thank you. Welcome, Yasin.
Steve, thank you so much for these lovely words, for the kind introduction. I feel blessed and very happy to be here, but also in general working for the school, for the great colleagues like you in the school. And I'm looking forward to many projects and achievements in the future as well. But thank you for having me here for this book.
Our pleasure. Yasin, tell us about the book. I think it's always a kind of good starter for 10 when we talk about a book. Share the book's origin story. Where did it come from? How did you guys come to write it? What's the book about and who's it for?
Good question, and that question actually triggered me to go back, take a step back, and reconsider the history of the book and how we came with it. And actually, it was back in the year 2017 when we were attending Academy of Management conference. So it's a conference we academics attend for the topics that we are working on and researching. And it was 2017, and another colleague of mine, like her name is Berin, she introduced me to Smriti, with whom now I'm working very closely. And she was like, you guys, you work on this topic, why don't you meet? So we just had coffee and we just had this idea coming out there to write it and to be able to edit the topics in this book. But the underlying logic for the book was that, so we wanted to talk about the topics that research didn't have the courage and didn't have the chance to be published on those areas, on those topics. Particularly two reasons. The very first reason was that this topic of idiosyncratic deals, we will discuss a little bit. It's I think it ignored some important elements to it, like private life, spousal support, partner support at home, and how it spills over back to work. So we really wanted to touch upon that important area of stakeholders. But as you know, without being published, it's quite difficult to do that. So we thought that an edited book where we can be relatively free intellectually as well as in terms of contributions might be a good idea. And the second topic was to be more critical of the concept itself again. So what we mean with ideals, is it really a mutual win-win situation, or is it an exploitation of certain employees in relation to other people, and the dark side of it in general? So what are the potential disadvantages and consequences for coworkers or for others who are excluded from those deals? So those were the two main areas areas and the questions that really triggered the creation, as I would say it, or the launch of that book with my colleague. And then it took another 2 years to be able to convince the contributors that although, you know, this is not going to possibly make you win some research related points, this will be an important intellectual contribution for you, and we would be delighted to have your chapters here. An important point that I would like to emphasize, I was very delighted to have Denise Rousseau's forward as well. She is the one who created the concept of psychological contract. And I think that's a really important concept in work organizational life, in leader-member exchange relationship, in leader and employee co-worker relationship. So your expectations from the manager and the manager's psychological expectations from you. And she took this concept to idiosyncratic deals, which is a more individualized, personalized deal that you strike with your manager. And I was delighted to see that she also endorsed the critical side of the concept of ideals, and that she was able to write a foreword for it, which to me meant a lot, because this was also the topic that my dissertation was on, my PhD dissertation. So it kind of painted a nice story for me, starting from PhD, those dark, relatively difficult years, to the bright years, coming to here with the ideals as a nice, important edited book now that I have. So this was more or less the story of the book. In terms of who it addresses or targets, I would say between practitioners and academics. So there are some important takeaway messages for practitioners who would like to, for example, implement ideals in their organizations, the kinds of interventions that they can run in the organization in order to manage the effective implementation of ideals. But then also we developed and designed future research ideas. So every chapter finishes with some future research ideas and suggestions and takeaway messages. And for scholars and researchers like all of us, I think it will be an important recipe of book for the future too.
Thanks for that, Yasin. I think that's a very, very full and interesting answer. I'm always surprised, or I'm one of the things that enthuses me about the book series is that oftentimes the book is a medium to say things that it would be harder to say in the context of a journal article.
Exactly.
And actually the opportunity to really kind of kick a field or a subfield forward actually quite substantially through a book where, as you say, you know, all the constraints of double-blind peer review and all that sort of thing are slightly relaxed, and you can be a bit freer and more critical with how you do it. I think that's one of the things that's very special about books, and I certainly see a fair bit of that in yours. I also love the book series because it forces me to engage with a body of thought often that I haven't given a great deal of thought to. And the whole ideals literature has really passed me by until I read your book over the last few weeks. So for those like me that were kind of new coming to the ideals kind of literature, introduce the idea of an idiosyncratic deal, if you would, right? What's the big idea at the heart of the ideals literature, and where does that come from?
Thanks for this great question, Steve. And that made me think about the concept itself before and after COVID, actually. So I think the meaning of the concept, the very managerial implications of the concept has changed drastically, I would say, before COVID and after COVID. So I think before COVID, how I would define and describe ideals would be a mutually defined and agreed upon terms of conditions between an employee, a focal employee, and a manager. And that manager can be your supervisor, your direct manager, HR representative, on the terms and conditions that are supposed to mutually benefit both parties. So this sounded very ideal to me. And in a world of work, this kind of ideal structure I thought would never exist. That would benefit the organization, that would benefit the employee, yet that would be a privileged deal that will be beneficial for both parties. So it would be, by definition, an ideal, an idiosyncratic deal that aims to meet your work-related needs, preferences, but also flexibility as well. So this, I would say, was the definition before COVID. And I think post-COVID and in these times of flexible and new ways of working, I think the very definition of ideals has adapted to what our needs are. And to me now, I would rather prefer to define it as a project for human engineering, social engineering at work, that rather places more importance on the dignity of the employee. So I rather, as one of the book chapter was focusing on it. So I like the dignity perspective of it as well. And dignity takes into account the unique needs and preferences of employees. and sometimes also takes into account the needs of the employees as well. So I think the needs of the employee has now been prioritized in relation to the definition of ideals that really focused on the performance outcomes of the employees. So post-COVID now, we can focus on what the unique needs and preferences of the employees are, what are their skill sets, and how the kinds of ideals that we are going to provide to this employee will help them deal with the matters at home as well as at work. So I think the very definition of ideals has now encapsulated the private life, the family life, and the work life. As we see in COVID, they've all been merged, and the boundaries between those three domains have been they have been vaguely left open. And I think with the definition of ideals, we can now start talking about their mutual integration. And the current definition we have now touches upon the leisure life, touches upon the family life, and now employees, I think, should have the courage to approach their line managers and talk about their needs and their wants and how they see themselves in the workplace in the very future. So I think this is the evolution to me that has grasped the concept of ideals from being very performance-driven pre-COVID to being very need, humane-driven, dignity-driven, looking at the values of the employees and how they fit with the organizational culture and the needs and wants with their line managers towards its implementation in the future.
It struck me reading the book that ideals are very varied. Right, you know, I think you talk about, you know, flexibility ideals, developmental ideals, a whole range of different things. Could you say a little bit about empirically tangible? What does an ideal look like? What kinds of ideals are there out there? And can you perhaps say a little bit about, you know, their prevalence? You know, what sorts of organizations have more of it? What sorts of organizations have less of them?
Sure. Great questions. And I think it touches upon, again, on two very distinctive features of ideals. And that also made me start researching this topic from that angle too, because I thought only managerial employees or elite employees were going to strike ideals because they're already enjoying a very privileged position at work. They're high performers or talented people. Therefore, they would ask for ideals. So in terms of the prevalence of ideals, what my research, for example, has shown is that flexibility ideals are more prevalent. And I'll talk a little bit about what actually we found, and that's been mostly cited in research, especially when it comes to scheduling and location ideals. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, so both of those research. So pre-COVID, a paper of ours that was published in Journal of Organizational Behavior introduced the concept of family performance. And through family performance, an employee was able to excel at work performance. So the idea of that paper, for example, was that flexibility ideals in terms of location and schedule flexibility, those employees who were given those flexibilities so that they can balance their work-life borders and boundaries, they showed better performance at home. And what we meant with better performance at home was to spend quality time with the partner, take care of the errands at home, and then, you know, think creatively and freely while you're at home about home-related issues. Like, for instance, moving. I'm in the stage of now moving my home from one place to another place, and that involves a lot of issues and hassles. Being freely able to talk about this or arranging it, and then spending quality time with your partners or with your kids or whoever is your family, that we defined as family performance. Therefore, we were able to explain that the reason why flexibility ideals worked for work performance is because it impacted on family performance. So that was one major finding. The second finding was that the support resources at home mattered, but for flexibility, family, so the kind of support mechanisms that are more prone to non-work life, let's say having a policy that supports your leave away, that gives you, let's say, a 2-day leave from your work in terms of when you have to deal with family matters. So we call this family supportive organizational culture, and that mattered a lot as well. So this was on the side of flexibility ideals. Then we had a number of papers on career ideals and task ideals as well. And what we found in task ideals and developmental ideals were that an interesting finding, I think, was that developmental ideals, they should be more dynamic. in relation to flexibility ideals. So flexibility you give once, and that's okay for the focal employee. But what we found was that developmental ideals, they have to be dynamic. What that meant for us, and it was, I think, a striking paper too, published in Occupational Psychology. Let's say, so the sample of that context was consultants, HR consultants. And over weeks, employees wanted to have small deals with their supervisors. So I think a striking impact of that was that you don't have to have a major ideal with your employer to feel better or to feel more committed to your organization. Every little step, every little contribution by your organization really mattered for those employees because they felt valued. Not only they felt valued, but then they were able to build upon their resources, structural resources. Those resources were the kinds of resources that are related to work. For instance, being able to attend training and developmental opportunities, or benefiting from online training opportunities, or having a direct communication with your supervisor as to where your career is moving, approach, or moving towards. So these were fine, these were important, but the most important explanation underpinning why employees actually performed better after developmental ideals was that they felt supported, they felt valued, and that those changed and varied across weeks. Examples included, for instance, being able to work from, so being able to identify your work task, adding more content to what you do, attending, training and developmental sessions, having a unique conversation with your HR manager about where, for instance, your career trajectory is going or is moving towards forward. That was on the developmental ideal side. And the least common one, or I would say, supposedly on theoretical level, the least common one is financial ideals. But again, as most of us might know, it is common, but in our research has actually shown that the frequency and the mean value of financial ideals are quite low. That means that actually people are more reluctant to talk about financial ideals. So a colleague of mine who has a chapter in this book has written a paper on the secrecy of ideals. And I think that's an interesting concept, the secrecy of ideals. And they found that regrets, contentment, and anger of coworkers were the most avoidance-oriented types of behaviors, or were the most proximal ways through which coworkers react to ideals when they found out about that. And their experimental research found that then people are more likely to keep their financial ideals secret. So there are three types of ideals that we found. These are flexibility ideals, developmental career-oriented ideals, and financial ideals. Flexibility is the most common one, but then financial ideals are the least common one. But I don't think it is the least common one because of my, because of my peer observation and empirical evidence, but people are just reluctant to talk about it, which touches upon on another yet important topic of fairness and differentiation.
Mm-hmm. We will definitely come to fairness and differentiation. In the book, you talk about, various contributors talk about essentially the distinction between employee-initiated ideals and employer-initiated ideals. Can you talk about, talk a bit about, why employees might seek ideals, why employers might seek ideals, and why each might agree to the other's ideals, if you see what I mean?
That's a very interesting concept, especially the employer-initiated one has never been explored in literature, and I'm glad to have that chapter in the book. Employee-initiated ideals, I think we, including myself, as all employees, we try to maneuver, we try to evaluate our careers from a more personalized perspective, and I usually like the approach of exploring this topic from a more individualization perspective, individualization of HR practices rather than having standard HR practices for everybody, and stepping up from the perspective of each individual having unique values and needs. I think it's that point when individuals, and as human beings, we are human beings and we compare ourselves with others. Social comparison theory says that. Upward comparison, vertical comparison, downward comparison, and ideals usually happen when you compare yourself to your peers. So social comparison theory from a theoretical perspective says that you compare your input-output balance, and when your input-output balance, or when you contribute more but receive less in comparison to other people, you start seeking for ideals. So unfortunately or fortunately, in a social setting, as we are social animals, what others have triggers our reactions. And I think, and I'm one of those people as well, being a shy person or not being able to approach your manager is one of the deficiencies of ideals. And I think negotiation literature might have interesting insights on that topic. But it's that point when I think the individual values their skills and contributions, and then think about what the organization in return can introduce in terms of skill sets, values, and adaptation mechanisms for that focal employee, so that both parties can be happy. These are usually employee-induced ideals, but I should say that there are exceptions. Now that especially we are more free to talk about family life and leisure life, I'm now observed that, and empirical evidence also says that, especially employees who have conflict in terms of managing work-family boundaries, like childcare, elderly care. So our research actually has said that childcare and elderly care consume people's personal resources, like their resilience, their focus, their attention, as a result of which they approach their managers and ask for ideals. So these colleagues, these employees are more likely to approach and seek ideals, irrespective of whether they are good performers or not. On the other hand, financial and developmental ideals are more likely to be initiated by star performers or talented employees, or those employees in different conditions. The idea that employers introducing ideals for focal employees, I think, is really interesting. And I like that idea because it's preemptive and it's very proactive. And I think it has this possibility of increasing the commitment, value, and contributions of that employee even more, because it signals that as an employer, as an organization, we have seen it, we have been proactive, we are valuing you, and we are giving this as a talent management tool to you so that you feel even more committed and your performance increases, or you engage in all different types of citizenship behaviors for the organization. Imagine, Steve, you're approaching a very talented employee in the organization. Hey, I've noticed this. You're doing great. Here is this that you can use for your career. I would assume that then this employee will develop a better social exchange relationship with the organization, going above and beyond, undertaking maybe different roles and responsibilities, having better relations with students and with collaborators. And so I think for the future of ideals, manager-initiated ideals could be a really interesting tool of talent management and performance management from a more proactivity perspective, rather than the employee-induced one. Because, now that got me thinking, because it has this advantage of, even if the employee declines it, then there is no consequence, because the first step has been initiated by the company. Therefore, there will be no regret, or there will be no avoidance-oriented or deviant-oriented behaviors towards the organization. Whereas, on the other hand, if there is deniance or if there is rejection, I think the consequences might be really catastrophic for both sides. So employer-induced ones can be more strategically conducted and implemented.
Yeah, I do think that's fascinating. Let's talk a bit about the kind of, I think you're explicit in the title of the book, exploring individual, organization, and societal perspective. Let's in a sense move to the organizational level. One of the things that seems complex to me as somebody who employs a lot of people is that interface between individuals and collectives, right? And if you like, the core thesis in the ideals literature is that individuals are heterogeneous, their needs are heterogeneous, their talents are heterogeneous, and responding through the employment relationship in a way that reflects and nurtures and optimizes given that heterogeneity is kind of organizationally and individually beneficial. The thing that occurs to me straight away as a quasi-public sector kind of person, if you like, is to say, actually, I can imagine some of the toxicity interpersonally and between co-workers and within groups that might come from that idiosyncratic deal kind of approach. Can you say a little bit about where the literature is in relation to understanding and exploring those individual group tensions in the context of ideals and how that might be addressed?
Sure. Thank you, Steve, again for this very important question. So I would divide this question into two elements. The one side rather looks at the positive side of what ideals can do in a team environment, and the other rather bigger and more important side is the dark side of ideals and the perceptions of unfairness and the reactions of other coworkers. Just to talk a little bit about the bright side, and I think it's only tiny and limited in terms of what it can do, is the sharing element of ideals. Part of our research has also shown that one way to counter the negative implications of ideas could be a focal employee being open and honest about that, sharing the benefits of ideals with all other people within the team environment. Let's say I received a developmental ideals in the form of attending a training and development session. Then if I come back and share the benefits of that ideal with the team members, then I think this could be a way of benefiting it. Or flexibility ideals, then taking over the burden from colleagues in terms of, let's say, if I'm working on shifts and between certain times, and if I'm able to also help the other colleague in terms of helping them address their issues, this could be a way to counterbalance the impact of ideals. But then that's also a very limited portion of it. And I think the more important area is the dark side of ideals. And there are different ways we can approach it. And the way I approach it is, again, building on my own research on differentiation. And there I try to emphasize three different elements. The very first element is the outcome favorability of coworkers, or technically or practically, if I get this, where will my coworkers be? So will their outcomes or will their situation be favorable or unfavorable if I get this? Because that's a key critical condition that determines the reactions of coworkers. It is the first one that I would look at. The second one is their future potential of obtaining similar ideals. And research says that if employees feel that there is a possibility for them to obtain similar ideals in the future, given a certain employee has that makes it even better. Then I would turn to leader-member relationship and look at it from a coworker perspective. Let's say person A and person B, and I'm person C, coworkers. I would observe the relationship between person A and person B, and that we call leader-member social comparison in literature. So to what extent the relationship between person A and person B is objective-based, observable, open, and transparent, then as a coworker, I would feel more confident about their relationship being based on objective criteria, would be the second one. And the third criteria, and Steve, you mentioned about the team and the organizational climate and how it impacts on the team climate, is that there is this interesting distinction between being in terms of organizational culture. One is performance culture that we refer, and the other one, mastery culture. In the performance culture, we know that everything is based upon your performance, your contribution. So it's like this give and take relationship on a very transactional based one. But the one that's more developmental oriented, the one that's more dignity perspective driven is mastery climate. And in the mastery climate, as the name implies, the underlying idea is that each and every employee should gain those skills and developmental opportunities that they can see themselves as the masters of their area. So every opportunity is given to every unique individual. Therefore, every unique individual then has this opportunity to progress on their work. These are the three very important elements looking at different facets of levels. But to me, that matters the most, I would say, is the procedural and interactional / interpersonal fairness. And maybe you want to talk about it a bit later on, but procedural fairness, basically coworkers, in very practical terms, if coworkers see and say that, okay, there are procedures that have been followed, and if I were to obtain similar ideals in the future, the same procedures would be relevant for me, then they will feel very supportive. They will then show all of their support. Then interpersonal and interactional fairness. And I don't think it is possible in every situation. So a manager cannot go and say, hey, team members, I've given this deal to person A, and I'm explaining it. I don't think it's practically relevant and important in every situation, but what theory says is that if everybody is transparent about that, people will be very supportive. Whereas for this one, I have some question marks because not every situation is explicit enough to be, to be all over there and to be shared in terms of when it comes to communication and information. Therefore, fairness is important, but to me, procedural fairness matters the most. So these would be the 4 conditions I would try to explore this area: coworker outcome favorability, coworkers' future possibility of obtaining similar ideals. Then the type of culture in the organization, is it performance driven? Is it mastery driven? Then I would look at the leader-member exchange relationship between 2 people. if it's objective based, if it's transparent, if it's visible. And the last one would be fairness. Fairness in terms of procedures and fairness in terms of communication. Let's leave manager aside. If the focal employee, because they also talk about friendship. Friendship is a very interesting phenomenon. If the focal employee is my friend, and if I think that my friend hasn't been open to me or colleague hasn't been open to me, research actually says that the negative reactions outweigh the benefits of those ideals. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that friendship comes into the scene, but then also fairness comes into the scene as well. So it's all this double-edged sword where the management of it is quite very difficult.
Which takes me naturally on to my next kind of set of concerns, in a sense. I mean, as you say, in a way, the ideals literature's core premises are kind of fairly utopian, right? And they are this kind of like, we can create a world of work where the circumstances and recognitions and tasks of work are organized openly, transparently, and individualistically, reflecting talents and preferences and constraints and all that kind of stuff. And we get a better organizational outcome from doing that. One thing that struck me about that was just how much HR work there is to do, right? If you think about the way, and I do a lot of HR work, as you might imagine, really policies, rules, frameworks, etc., that treat individuals similarly are part of how we simplify, but also help ensure some sort of consistency in how we operate in our kind of leader-member kind of relationships. It struck me in reading the book just how complex and potentially burdensome and potentially challenging the task of people management is if you want to kind of fully embrace an ideals kind of world. And I wonder whether what views you have on, what would human resource management look like? What would people management look like? And how do we develop institutions and skills and processes to deal with what seems to me like a massive giant leap forward in how people management works in organizations?
As you said, it would be a massive leap forward in terms of transferring the standards or one-size-fits-all approach to human resource management to unique and individualized implementations of HR practices. So my personal take on this, Steve, is I think that in the broader frame of HR and people management and performance management, we should create a room for ideals, and we should try to create a room for ideals and their post management. So I think I'll give you my ideas and my framework on this. And I think what's really missing is their post implementation, their post management, and how we tie it with performance management. And one of the co-authors, and I should pay tribute to this co-author, Arun, has written a very nice chapter on that, is how can we adapt HR practices, the standard HR practices, to address ideals. And I think it would all really start with developing rules, policies, and principles once ideals are struck. And I think setting exemplars for each and every unique ideal, then collating them to turn them into some certain policies and principles of HR practices and implementations in an organization could be one starting point. Let's say person A had one, and these were the criteria that this person A had this, and these were the conditions based on which that person has been given those. Then kind of institutionalizing it, collating them as sets of principles and rules for the future might be a starting point. I know that it doesn't sound ideal, but it could be a one starting point, because then it will set precedent for all other types of ideals. I would like to emphasize one point here, though, is ideals run the risk of alienating a focal employee and positioning that employee as an elite worker among all others. And in order to manage that perception, I think perspective, and that's what literature says, is that we should be able to tie it with performance management. And again, I think it begs the question of establishing a individual performance management tied to that ideal, and then composing that into the room of this bigger strategic HRM framework or people management framework. Practically speaking, let's say person A had one ideal on career-related topic. Not five criteria, but these are the points or aspects that you've obtained from that ideal. These were given, based on this and that, maybe one of them is performance or not, or needs-based one. Then feedback system, and I think performance management system will matter in order to turn these deals into kind of mutually beneficial, sort of effective for the organization as well as for the employee, because the employee who is in receipt of those, they wouldn't want to be seen as elite employees or those kinds of employees who've taken them, but then who are not so motivated or who would get away with not doing anything. Then we would want them to feel motivated, but also not payback. I don't want to use the term payback, but show the contribution towards the organization in terms of citizenship behavior, in terms of performance management, but explicit expectations. So if I were an HR manager or a supervisor, I would then have a written record of performance management, tracking the performance outcomes of employees in relation to that ideal in a specific time framework. That would then feed into the fairness of that system. Then I think that would then sort of ameliorate or eliminate the potential burden of ideal, because then you would be able to check it. Because otherwise, if you leave it too vague, it would look like a gift given to an employee in return for nothing. That's my take on performance management side of it. And I think by doing that, we can turn it into a talent management tool as well. It can be an effective and quite influential talent management tool too.
Yeah, fantastic. Just to flag for participants, I see one or two questions coming through, which is really great. Thank you for that. Keep them coming. In a minute or two, we'll turn to those. I wonder, the thought I had, a reflection on, as I read Yasin, was about the contexts in which ideals research is done. And it seemed to me, and I've worked in environments where employer-employee relations are governed by enterprise agreements and other kind of formal architectures. And of course, in some country settings, law plays a bigger role and obligations for organizations come with that. It struck me that ideals was quite an American kind of idea, where, organizationally, the individual employees were sort of negotiating individually with their organizations. I wonder whether you could say a bit about where the comparative or the context variety is in this literature, and whether ideals research has really, is it global? Can you say a bit about how ideals situated in different institutional contexts kind of have been explored?
Thank you, Steve, for this question. And I would say that it's still not a global phenomenon. And a meta-analytic review of this concept, of this construct, that was conducted 2 years ago, 2020. And some of my studies were included in that one as well. I like the finding in that study. So it makes a difference between cultural orientations at the country level. So basically drawing on Hofstede. So Hofstede is one of the, for the audience or not, into one of the cross-cultural researchers who makes a difference between the impact of a certain construct in terms of when it comes to consequences. So the finding actually says that it is a striking difference in terms of two elements. And one element is power distance. So rather than differentiating, let's say, Western, non-Western, in countries where people see there's a huge power distance for the audience, meaning if I feel it very comfortable to approach my supervisor and negotiate things, in other words, respecting the hierarchy rather than respecting the needs, abilities, or the position of the employee. In countries where there is a huge extent of power distance, people are more reluctant to negotiate ideals. And the second element, and I think that comes to the gender issue, is egalitarianism, where there is high level of egalitarianism, again, including the Germany, UK, Netherlands, and United States. So these are the countries on the so-called Western side of the world. Ideals literature has been represented. Then there's a great extent of emerging research in countries like Turkey, Pakistan, I would say India, and China. Interestingly, again, an emerging body of literature. And that meta-analytic review has found out that, again, in egalitarian countries, ideals are more likely to be negotiated, whereas in less egalitarian countries, they are not. And I think there are so many implications of that interesting finding in terms of the negotiation power, the situation of men versus women, but then also the extent to which you trust and respect hierarchy And uncertainty avoidance. Sorry, I forgot the third element was uncertainty avoidance. So if you see your future a bit uncertain in that organization, you're less likely to negotiate because you're running the risk of losing your face value in front of your supervisor. And I think, and knowing some certain countries like Turkey, I'm Turkish coming from Istanbul, knowing the fact that people really respect face value, or India or China, then I would imagine conditions where people are less reluctant to negotiate ideals. So it's definitely not a global phenomenon yet. And there are definitely cultural differences that explain why in certain contexts it's more prevalent, whereas in some other contexts it's less prevalent. And I think personally, and I would say as a researcher as well, the concept of psychological contract is more prevalent than I think ideals. Because it's more cognitive based, it's all in your mindset, it's all what's happening in your mind, and you have this perceptual contract in your mind of your expectations from the company. Whereas with ideals, it's all supposedly, it's supposed to be written, transparent, and objective. And to what extent are employment relationships open to this, especially in contexts where we have labor unions or protective agreements, is a big question mark.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating reflection. Thanks. We will begin to go to questions. I've got a long list still to go at, but let's give someone else an opportunity. Phil asked a really good question. In a way, it's kind of to a similar related issue as context. And Phil's question is, how prevalent are these ideals among SMEs, who are the resource constrained but constitute the bulk of employment in the economy? So again, kind of, you can imagine this in a big management consultant. You know, what might this look like, and what does research say about contexts that may be kind of smaller organizations?
Thanks, Phil, and good to see you here. So for SMEs, that was an interesting point because we just collected data on SME context, especially post-COVID. What in SMEs happens is that people engage in job crafting. A bit of tangent, going a bit tangent to the topic of ideals. Job crafting is this proactive efforts initiated by the employee on their task, on their job, without necessarily having a supervisor consent. So imagine that you're working on a task and you're redefining the boundaries of that work. And SMEs are more likely to have job crafters rather than ideals, because ideals necessitate this existence of supervisor, then the power of the supervisor, the authority of consenting for that ideal, then going back to the HR and thinking about the SME context where things really happen in a more non-institutionalized manner, that HR emerges in SMEs. And what we found is that job crafters, there are job crafters, task crafters, and in time, and we ran an intervention with an SME actually, and what they really wanted was that they see that people are proactive, they're working on their own time schemes, and those managers in the SME, they wanted to have a bit of a control on the job crafters, and they were interested in the idea of turning job crafting into ideals. So I would imagine it's like a continuum where on the left-hand side you have job crafters who are more autonomous, who are more free, and who don't necessarily have the consent of the supervisor. Then those job crafters turns into idealers. And I think SMEs are more on the left-hand side of this continuum, with who lack this institutional power of HR. Then going on towards the right-hand side, then the more it's institutionalized, I would say, the more ideals become more prevalent. So I would imagine job crafting is this informal way of negotiating ideals.
Yeah, and I can see that in some of the work I've done on how organizations deal with employee health issues does speak to some of that job crafting ideals kind of interface among SMEs, which have a greater level of flexibility in lots of ways. Another great question from Omar. I won't begin to repeat the Turkish greeting at the outset of that, but thank you for the question, Omar. Omar's question is about employees and their agreeableness and their capacity to exert themselves in ideals processes. And the question runs, it seems that employee levels of trait agreeableness are a key variable in the success of ideal negotiations. Less agreeable employees securing ideals that are more in their favor. So it's about this, individuals who are aggressive and go after things, maybe they're the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. If that's true, and that feels kind of face valid to me, what can we do to help employees structurally, through training, through other interventions, to help employees be able to exert themselves in ideals negotiations more appropriately?
Omar, thank you. Interesting question. Unlike what actually it looks like on a face value, literature actually is mute and actually has one non-significant findings when it comes to so-called extroversion versus introversion, agreeableness versus being all over the place, or neuroticism. So the big five, interestingly, does not work for ideals. So unlike what we assume, extrovert people are not more successful in obtaining ideals, or introvert people are not less successful in obtaining ideals. And I really like that whole idea, because the personality literature has also kind of confirmed that it's always in between ambivalent people. And actually personality, in that interesting paper that was published a year ago, they say that personality is very dynamic. So unlike what we assume, changes in context, changes across time, changes across months, rather the reflections of personality changes. So in one context, you can really be introvert. In another context, you can really be extrovert. And two interesting things I think may inform us all about all this topic. The first one is self-efficacy. So what literature says is people who actually trust on their credentials, trust on their skills and abilities, are more likely to obtain ideals. So self-efficacy is not a personality, but it's also not something that is related to context. It's something personal to you. It's about your feelings about how your skill sets are good, and that you can achieve something given to you, and that you're valuable, and that you're good in the market value. So literature talks about self-efficacy. Then literature talks also a little bit about proactive personality. So I like the approach of proactive personality. So proactive people are not necessarily extroverted people, nor introverted people, nor neurotic people. They're just people who act with their self-initiatives, with self-driven motives. So I would assume, for instance, myself, I'm more proactive rather than being an introvert or extrovert. And I like the literature's finding in the sense that they say that proactive people, because they are more likely to appreciate the opportunity of approaching somebody, like taking this first step, but not as an opportunistic manner, just because they notice that there's a situation here, and that these are my skill sets and valuable contributions that I can make, and this is what the organization can offer in return. They can then approach and strike these deals. So what we can do in organizations is to try to develop an environment for proactivity. So there are many ways of doing that. Like one of them could be running an intervention program. The second one could be measurement of proactivity. Then the third one could be dividing among employees and deciding, control group, experimental group, who are more proactive versus who are less proactive. And again, I'm not saying that everybody should be proactive, but I'm just saying that proactivity is one contextual condition that explains why some employees are more successful in that. And you can definitely be a more introvert person. It's just, I think, about having that communication and conversation.
Mm. What about gender? Is there a gendered lens on ideals, Yasin? Where's research in relation to that? Because as I hear you talk about proactivity and so on, I'm minded of the literatures that say a lot about female employees being a bit more reluctant to perceive of their self-efficacy and so on. And then does that mean that they might be less keen to go for ideals? And I wondered, is there a sort of stylized fact around gender and ideals?
So for that, actually, what literature and what our findings have shown is that we can divide between pre and post agreement. So pre-employment or pre-recruitment ideals, we call them ex ante, ex post. Ex ante ideals are more successfully negotiated by men in comparison to women, but interestingly, it doesn't say whether they're successful or not. Pre-recruitment. Post-recruitment, however, is interesting. It paints a different picture. It says that women, in comparison to men, are more likely to negotiate and successfully obtain post-recruitment ideals. Interesting. I wasn't expecting this, but we should bear in mind that, again, the literature on ideals is still very contrived to a certain group of scholars and researchers. It's still a very, I would say, a very limited area of research, and therefore, how representative is a sample? I'm just talking on the size of the samples that I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
And I would like to emphasize one point is that, so what we have found is non-managerial employees also strike ideals, and it's prevalent among them. So we had a sample of call center agents, then administrative staff in a Spanish organization, then replicated in a British and Turkish Turkish context, Turkish organization, that call center agents, non-managerial employees, they all strike all different kinds of ideals. Small things rather, but those small things make a big difference. So in general, on this topic, my take is, if as an organization manager, you have the resources, giving those resources, even if it's a little bit, matters a lot, because it has this signaling function, then it has this social exchange function, reciprocity function, that we see you, that we value you, that we take into account your contributions, and we know that you will do great in the future. Therefore, even if it's a little bit for now, here it is, take it, and we're sure that you will do great. My take is on all these, although it sounds very simplistic, is generally the amount really doesn't seem to matter quite a lot. So what matters, I think, is the intention and the act of giving.
Let's talk about COVID a bit, right? What's the ideals perspective on the future of work? You talked a little bit about the fact that, the old ideals conversation was very organizational performance driven, so if we strike ideals, then we get more out of our employees, and that's good for teams, it's good for our organization, and that in a sense the post or through COVID conversation has shifted more to a kind of morality and or social consciousness of the value of ideals in boundary navigation and so on. So where are you in terms of the kind of Jacob Rees-Mogg, everyone back to the workplace, no ideals kind of framework versus something that is much more sophisticated and one might say contemporary? How has ideals research so far speculated and or examined what the pandemic and the experience of the pandemic means for the future of ideals?
Great question, Steve. Thanks a lot. So to reflect on this point, I would touch upon the findings of our study that we conducted during COVID times. So we've collected diary data from employees. Well, we thought it was going to be the last end of the COVID, and that corresponded to 2021 April. And we thought that was going to be the last wave of COVID, but then it continued. So we could not continue on the collection of data because there's a limit to what extent you can collect data from people. So it was a diary data, and we asked employees to respond on a survey on a daily basis. That's what diary method of collection means. Therefore, we were able to collect dynamic, the implications of the phenomenon as it was happening on that moment. I would like, from those findings, I would like to really underpin 3 points that were not on the spotlight in this ideals literature beforehand. The first one is health-related outcomes of employees. So the concept of ideals is happening in the work domain, but health wasn't really the big issue or wasn't the focus. And reflecting on other findings as well, what we've found is that mental resilience, well-being, sleep quality, sex drive were the 4 factors that actually had tremendous impact on people's work lives. And that we explain with this phenomenon of spillover. So what happens at home, it does really have effect on what happens at work. And that's not a huge finding. I mean, that's not dramatic. That is true, but we were able to show that. And then death anxiety as well. So interestingly, with ideals, people connected that, and I can associate that very much myself as well. People connected it with death anxiety. So if they didn't have ideals, then they were, because of COVID, then they had these symptoms and stress reflections. Well-being declined, sex drive declined, and relationship with the spouse and partners deteriorated quite extensively. Most importantly, sleep quality. And we should not ignore sleep quality because it's a very important topic in occupational health, but quite ignored in management literature. And sleep quality does really affect your next day performance. So we collected data on sleep quality as well. And as you might guess, if employees are given flexibility ideals, then they report better sleep quality, better spousal relationships. However, then here I would like to also emphasize that a second point is the segmentation preference. So your question about should we be back, should we not be back? An important contextual condition here that we should take into account is employee segmentation preference. And our findings actually show that there are 2 broad categories of people: segmentators versus differentiators. Segmentators are those people who would really prefer a clear-cut separation, division between work and home. So for those people, the impact of COVID was dramatic, was bad. It had its toll on all sorts of ways. But then we have the integrators as well, like me, who are okay with integrating work family and who also don't mind working from the kitchen table while the kids, or having a discussion with the partner at home, or running away the errands. Then if you are rating higher on that dimension on being integrator, then this vague distinction between work and home doesn't matter for you. It actually works for you. Therefore, you are good at managing the implications of COVID inflexibility. So that could be one way of looking at this issue. To what extent you feel yourself your segmentator versus your integrator. Obviously, then the spousal support is very important, has become an important element. But we developed this concept of work-related spousal support. So to what extent your spouse is supportive for you for the work matters. So let's say you go back home, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're talking about work-related issues, obviously you're sharing and communicating. If your spouse offers you support in terms of, let's say, how to solve that issue or brings a perspective, that has a more important, I would say, more significant impact in driving your so-called performance rather than just sharing and communicating. Obviously, spousal support within the domain is very important, but if there's a significance or signaling effect of that support spilling over to work domain, then it will obviously be more important and more significant and well received in the work domain for the next day. So it's quite a complex topic, and I try to look at it from different perspectives, like segmentation, preference, personality, spousal support. And
we're still there, Yasin. We're still there. So fundamentally, I think there's plenty of work to be done. I'll ask the last question. Time is against us, so a relatively brief answer, please, Yasin. It struck, I think, probably me and a number of others that Ideals seems like a framework, a lens that seems to have more traction when it comes to professional work. To what extent has the literature really looked at things like production line, factory workers, context, kind of different kinds of context, fast food and so on. Is this a generalizable kind of thing to those kinds of contexts, or really does it have the most power in service and professional setting?
So I think that's a great question. And the way I think ideals might work in different contexts is to look at different dimensions of ideals. An example, and I've used the British Work Employment Relations Survey recently on reduced workload arrangements. So reduced workload arrangement is a subcomponent of ideals that can be applicable to employees who work in shifts. So I would assume it would be manufacturing production line employees. Reflecting that finding onto your question, Steve, I think what we found in that representing the Britain, the United Kingdom, and published recently, when employees have the chance of reducing their workloads with the corresponding terms and conditions, and they don't mind whether their salaries decrease as well. But if they feel that they can benefit from it, and if they benefit from it, their autonomy, their sense of autonomy increase, their sense of freedom increase, therefore effective commitment increase. So I would assume that in this context as well, the similar finding would happen. So ideals can be implemented in different facets and ways. One could be reduced load work arrangement. The other could be rescheduling the shifts. Then the other could be task ideals, but in terms like schedule ideals, but in terms of, for instance, giving people more holiday leave away or compensating employees for their family holidays. Letting them attend training and development. So there are all these sorts of ideals that can be done in professional stuff. And I think autonomy, freedom, sense of entitlement, sense of fairness would be some of the mechanisms that would explain the positive impact of it. And there is no research on that to that point, definitely, as far as I know. And I think it's this fertile area where we can conduct more research.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, it leaves it to me to thank you, Yasin, for sharing a fascinating book. I think a really interesting phenomenon and lots of work still to be done. So thank you, everybody, for attending today. I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thanks a lot.